Welcome to an Odyssey in Mixology and to the second part of my segment on old fashions. In my last video, I proved that Wild Turkey 101 was the best common budget bourbon for an old fashioned, and in this video, I'm going to figure out the best old fashioned recipe using it. Now, if you haven't liked and subscribed, then please do so, but above all else, enjoy. So this bottle of Wild Turkey 101, and every other bottle for that matter, balances the oak, spice, and light chocolate notes that I want in a budget bourbon. It does this better than most others in the non-rye, non-wheated, but still budget-friendly category of bourbons. It's common, of higher proof, and an absolute bargain at $25. Now, I compared all the budget bourbons in my last video using a pretty simple old-fashioned recipe. It consisted of 2 ounces of bourbon, a 1/4 ounce of Demerara syrup, 3 dashes of Angostura bitters, and a generously sized orange peel. So this recipe keeps the drinks focused on the bourbon, but it lacks some of the complexity and the cherry flavors that I just seek out in better old fashions. Not only that, but there's a lot of different ingredients that can be used in an old fashioned. I don't really know how they compare side by side. The ultimate simple old fashioned recipe might be some combination that I've never had before. So to try to find this, I'm going to try every combination of sweeteners, bitters, cherry, and orange to try and find that perfect simple recipe that goes with this perfect budget bourbon. Now that's a bit daunting despite there only being 4 things that I can change, but here's the problem. If I say that I'm not using any ingredients that are either special or rare, there are still a lot of different types of each of these flavors to pick from. This outlines what I'm trying in each category. Obviously, the first row contains different kinds of sweeteners, the next addition is cherry ingredients, followed by orange ingredients, and then lastly, different potential garnishes. What I have in front of me will make 432 unique old fashions, and that's not even accounting for changes in the volume or doubling up of each. That is purely the number of unique combinations that I can make from these easily attainable yet budget-friendly ingredients. Now, I'm going to go ingredient by ingredient, and once I pick the best ingredient of a single type, I'm going to move on to the next one until the entire old-fashioned recipe is complete. For a simple old-fashioned, I've in the past defaulted to a simple syrup, and that means sugar and water are the only ingredients I need. For a normal white cane sugar simple syrup, I use a 1-to-1 ratio of sugar to water. I bring 1 cup of water to a boil, cut the heat to low once it does, and then add 1 cup of white sugar. This mixture will simmer for about 5 minutes, and although it'll dissolve by itself, I always stir throughout. After the 5 minutes are up, the new syrup should cool before bottling and storing. Now, this process is the same for brown and Demerara sugar, but I generally use a slightly different ratio for brown sugar. White sugar is white because it's fully refined. The original color and flavor is stripped out of it during the manufacturing process. Now, brown sugar is often made up of the same refined white sugar, but molasses is then added in right before packaging. Now, because it's a little less sweet, I usually use 1.25 parts of light brown sugar to 1 part of water. Demerara sugar is more unique though. It's less refined, and that original molasses is left in the sugar rather than getting stripped out beforehand. This leads to a much more similar flavor to the brown sugar, but it is slightly different. It also retains the same level of sweetness as a white sugar, so a 1-to-1 ratio for a Demerara simple syrup works really well here too. Whilst a bit less common to do homemade, gum syrups are still very available today, and you might recognize this ingredient from Jerry Thomas's original 1862 whiskey cocktail, but companies like Lieber & Co. sell both white and Demerara versions. These syrups start out in life like most simple syrups, but gum arabic is added. Now, this is actually a tree resin and not a tree sap as it's sometimes assumed. Adding gum resin to your syrups creates a thicker and smoother texture. Now, the flavor is altered, but not a lot, even if gum syrups are seen as an upgrade over regular simple syrups. So when comparing these different sweeteners, I'm using 1 ounce of a bourbon and then 1/8 of an ounce or 2 bar spoons of each of these sweeteners. Now, because this is a half-size cocktail, I'm also adding a 1/4 ounce of an ice water, which is going to mimic the dilution that I would get from the full-size drink. This obviously is not a full or ready-to-drink cocktail, but it'll become that as I start getting through these ingredients. So for the time being, I just want to see how the sweeteners interact with the bourbon. I obviously want this to maintain kind of the classic old-fashioned characteristics, but depending on which one I choose can have a much different influence on future ingredients. So this is kind of the good place to start to set the tone for the rest of the drink. So right off the bat, 3/4 teaspoon of white sugar is not fully dissolved. And the taste is a bit thin despite it not diluting the bourbon. It kind of adds nothing to it. It just tastes like sweet wild turkey, which is nice, but it's not really what I'm looking for. I want something with a little bit more punch, a little bit more interest as I'm making kind of my perfect old-fashioned cocktail. The simple syrup one is better because the texture is a little thicker. It has better mouthfeel, but the flavor is pretty much unchanged from the regular, just raw sugar added in. There might be just a little bit of extra kind of roastedness from the act of making a simple syrup, but again, it's so minute. So this one with the brown sugar maintains the slightly thicker texture of the simple syrup, obviously, but it also has some of the molasses flavor, which is nice. It's a little bit darker. It has maybe a little bit of bitterness in addition to the sweetness. And then you get that toffee caramel flavor that comes forward as well. This one kind of leans me a bit more towards butterscotch, but like a dark roasted butterscotch. The Demerara sweetener is nicer. It is less butterscotch forward. It's actually a little bit less molasses and caramel forward as well, but I get hints of vanilla on this one. And this also lets the bourbon show through a little bit more because I think it's more of a complementary flavor rather than the toffee and the butterscotch of this one and just kind of the thinness of this one. But these are the ones that I'm really interested in because the gum syrups are kind of a direct upgrade to the homemade version. So this is obviously a white cane gum syrup. And so realistically, it should taste fairly similar to this one, but the mouthfeel and the silkiness of this cocktail should be better. And it is. The mouthfeel is nicer. It feels a little bit more cohesive of a drink. The sweetness is less pronounced, even though it's a similar level, as in it tastes less like bourbon with sugar added in and more just like a sweet bourbon, if that makes sense. This one also has kind of a bit of a sourness to it, which is interesting. It's not unwelcome, but it's also slightly unexpected. Now, regardless, that is still lacking some of the complexity that I find in the brown and the Demerara sugars. Whilst I do think this is an upgrade to the regular simple syrup, it's not really what I imagine when I think the perfect old-fashioned. But the Demerara gum syrup is the best of both worlds. So it retains the molasses flavor, which I like. It has the bitterness that I see in the Demerara sugar. It's got the cohesiveness of the drink. It feels like it's a molasses sweeter forward bourbon. It feels like it goes together. Now, the reason I have two maple syrups up here is because this one is just about the cheapest maple syrup I can find. It's not real maple syrup. It's high fructose corn syrup with maple flavoring. And then this is a barrel-aged Vermont maple syrup, which was kind of the nicest maple syrup that I could get my hands on. And right off the bat, looking at the two of these, the Vermont maple syrup, which is pure maple syrup, is mixed into the drink with the same amount of stirring as the rest of these. This one has not mixed nicely into the drink. I see syrup lines, there's different colorations throughout the glass, and frankly, I've mixed this one more than the others because I kind of saw that as I was pouring it. So if I want to do a bit of a throwback to my high school chemistry classes, then this one is not a homogeneous mixture. The taste is okay. The flavor profile is distinctly maple. It's not necessarily an unnatural taste, even though I know this is mostly artificial. I will say the aftertaste on that tastes a little plasticky. And so from that standpoint, it is very much a negative, but if what you're trying to do is bring a maple flavor to an old-fashioned in the cheapest way possible, then that's not the worst idea. So compared to the really nice maple syrup though, head and shoulders different. So the aftertaste on that one is woody. That does tie in with the bourbon really nicely. The maple flavor itself is a more full flavor, even though it's less pronounced. There's depth to the maple flavor, whereas in the store-bought cheap one, there's really no depth to that maple flavor beyond that initial kick of artificial mapleness. All right, so I really like the combination with the real barrel-aged maple syrup, but to be totally honest, it's still deviating too far from a classic old-fashioned flavor. And whilst I do want this drink to be interesting, I don't want it to stray too far. So unfortunately that's out, but I think that is actually my favorite. Now, between the homemade Demerara syrup and the Demerara gum syrup, the Demerara gum syrup is better in just about every way, but only just a little bit in every category. From a texture standpoint, this is a little bit more silky, but that's not really what I drink an old-fashioned for. In some cocktails, that's important, but in an old-fashioned, not so much. It is nicer, so it does get a mark in its favor there. From a flavor standpoint, they're like 98% the same. There is a little bit more flavor here. I do actually like the sourness that's here. It's not something that I taste when trying the syrup straight, but it is present in the old-fashioned. The gum syrups are both basically $1 an ounce, and I think that's really going to be the deciding factor on if you go with those versus the homemade one. Now, I tend to not use a lot in an old-fashioned, and I tend to lean towards other drinks when I'm just enjoying making cocktails. So frankly, that doesn't bother me too much because I'm going to take a long time to go through these. I think the gum syrup is better, and that's going to be my pick for the Wild Turkey 101 and the rest of this drink going forward. The next ingredient to this ultimate old-fashioned is the bitters. Now, I am going to try cherry and orange bitters later on, so this is more about whether I keep the Angostura aromatic bitters or not. A lot of brands make aromatic bitters, but few brands have Angostura's availability, and that's a problem for this video. Instead of comparing the boutique brands, I'm going to compare the Angostura bitters against a different classic bitters that are almost as common as these. Whereas Angostura bitters have a darker clove-like flavor, Peychaud's bitters have a brighter cherry and citrus flavor with not so subtle anise or licorice notes. They both rely on gentian root for their distinctive bitter component, but that's about their only similarity. They honestly couldn't be more different, yet they both complement different aspects of the bourbon. And these drinks again follow the same recipe of 1 ounce of bourbon, 1/8 of an ounce of Demerara gum syrup, and now 2 dashes of bitters. I've also bumped the ice water up to 3/8 of an ounce to again reflect the dilution from the final full-size drink. The Peychaud's bitters definitely takes the drink in a new direction, especially when compared to the old-fashions I was drinking in the first video. It's a welcome red fruit and cherry flavor, even though it's not necessarily cherry bitter, in the same way that the cherry bitter I'm going to use later on is. The anise flavor is equally prominent, and although some people hate licorice, which is often compared to, anise is more palatable. Now, bourbons develop red fruit flavors as they age, so this does slot right into the Wild Turkey 101's flavor profile, and I think the anise enhances the wood flavor in an interesting way. So the Angostura bitters creates that classic spiced wood flavor that you would expect in an old-fashioned. It has hints of raisin and clove, and of course that slightly mouth-drying sensation from the bitter gentian root itself. It's obviously not a bitter cocktail, but like most old-fashions, the bitters just add complexity. But in this instance, it is more bitter than the one using the Peychaud's. Now, this does lean into and enhance kind of the spice from the rye components of the bourbon's mash bill, as well as the wood finish, and it's really nice in this regard. Now, determining which one of these is best is not really an answerable question because they're both different. They bring different things to the table, but I think the quality level is about the same for each of them. I actually do prefer the Peychaud's bitters, so that is going to be my primary in this drink, but I still want the wood flavors from the Angostura to be present. The Peychaud's was a little bit too cherry and anise forward, and the Angostura bitters just kind of lacked some of that brightness that I want. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to remove a dash, so it's going to go from 4 in the final cocktail down to 3, and I'm going to use 2 dashes of the Peychaud's and 1 dash of the Angostura. It's going to be more balanced, and it's going to retain the nice flavors from each bitters, whilst also leaning it more towards the anise and cherry flavor that I liked so much. Peychaud's bitters is already bringing some red fruit flavor forward, so I have to be a lot more careful with adding cherry to this drink. Cherry bitters, like those from Old Forester and Fee Brothers, are pretty safe bets when creating red fruit flavor, but cherry liqueurs and cherry syrups work as well. From a cherry liqueur standpoint, this sounds kind of controversial, but whether you're using the Luxardo cherry liqueur or a more cherry-forward liqueur like those from Herring, this is actually common for old fashions made around the Prohibition time period. One thing, we're adding in a lot of other different flavors and liqueurs to that base whiskey cocktail. When making these next set of old fashions, I've bumped everything up to the full ratio so that I can really fine-tune some of these lower volume ingredients. And starting with the cherry bitters, the cherry bitters from Old Forester also have notes of dark chocolate in them, and that is good, but even if it's not sweeter, it's coming off a bit more as a dessert drink because now chocolate is getting added in there. It wouldn't be that extreme if I was just using the Angostura bitters, but because the Peychaud's bitters are bringing a lot of that cherry and anise flavor forward too, this just feels like it's doubling up and it's removing the focus from the bourbon. Now, Luxardo makes their liqueur from Marasca cherries, and despite this being one of the most famous and common cherry liqueurs, it's not actually overly cherry forward. It has more of a smooth red fruit wood and nuttiness flavor in addition to the expected sugar. So this will make the drink sweeter, and that's part of the reason that I've kept the sugar content down in a lot of these drinks to begin with. I'd say in the old fashioned, this is actually good because it's adding another layer of complexity to the Peychaud's bitters rather than any new flavors. The cherry is slightly heightened, but it's also kind of drawn out into something a bit more complex. And I'd say despite the liqueur's sweetness, this actually has a bit of a darker flavor profile, and that does work well with the other ingredients. Now, this is the Luxardo liqueur, but this is the Luxardo cherry. And the Luxardo cherry is probably the most common and famous cocktail cherry in existence. And that is really nice. Without the Peychaud's, this would probably be my favorite, hands down. It brings sweetness, but the full cherry flavor is just far more intense than that of the Luxardo liqueur and from bitters itself. However, similar to the cherry bitters, this syrup is bringing too much cherry flavor forward, but the quality of that cherry flavor is so much higher here. So in this case, the subtle cherry from the liqueur actually works better in creating more balanced old fashioned, only because it's not overdoing the cherryness. Now, the flavor is also wonderful, and I would not go back and get rid of the Peychaud's in order to justify using the cherry syrup, even though it's a better version of cherry. And that's kind of what I'm struggling with in this, because I want to pick this one, but if I pick this one, it becomes a cherry old fashioned, and that's really not the goal of this video. So I'm going to stick with the Luxardo liqueur because it increases the complexity in the drink in a way that I enjoy. Sometimes the only orange in an old fashioned is the citrus peel oils being expressed over the top of the drink. It's a very invading aroma in a good way, and that's often enough to trick you into thinking there's more orange in an old fashioned than there actually is. So whilst the orange peel oil might be enough, I usually want there to be a bit more because I think that flavor just goes so nicely with the bourbon itself. In the past, when I've wanted to add orange flavor to an old fashioned, I've used an extra dash or two of orange bitters, a bar spoon of orange liqueur, or even cutting the orange garnish to include just a little bit of the orange flesh and juice. Like the cherry, the intention is never to make an orange cocktail, but these can add a little bit more intensity to a sometimes too subtle flavor. So here are the 3 different old fashions with the final orange ingredient included. The orange bitters create kind of a thin but striking orange peel flavor, and unlike the Angostura bitters and the Peychaud's bitters, these don't have gentian root in them, so it's an easy addition. These are obviously just as common as the Angostura aromatic bitters. It's okay. It doesn't do too much for the drink as well. There's no added depth to the flavor. It's just this quick note of orange that you taste and then it goes away. So before I talk about the drink, It's worth noting that this is not a triple sec, this is an orange liqueur. And using a triple sec, which you would in like a margarita, will give you a very different drink. The reason I've chosen this is that it's a more intense and natural orange flavor, and whilst it might be a little less common than a triple sec, it does better match the other two versions up here. So this does give the orange I want. The orange is not as fleeting as the bitters. It sticks around longer. I think it works better with the other wood flavors in this bourbon. I actually do like this one quite a bit, but the mouthfeel is now becoming a negative. It's more syrupy, and with this being another liqueur, there's a lot of sugar going in here, and generally that's something I try to avoid. Lastly, it's guaranteed that this old fashioned will have an orange garnish. So instead of just taking the peel, I've cut quite a bit deeper so that some of the juice can seep out into the old fashioned. And that probably equates to maybe a little under a bar spoon of fresh orange juice. But here's the thing, it's the freshest and it's the most potent orange flavor per volume of the ones up here. And this one just tastes better as well. So I'm a firm believer that fresh ingredients are better. That being said, the flavor is actually less orange forward here than it is in a liqueur, and maybe to some extent the bitters. And the reason for that is that this is more subtle, but it's more full. So whereas the bitters is fleeting, this sticks around quite a bit longer. It's part of the first flavor that I taste when tasting the bourbon, and it's part of the last flavor that I taste as that sip is kind of going away. It's really good, and considering it's also part of the garnish, it's also not necessarily any additional cost or effort to make. So ranking wise, I think I would probably go the fresh orange, the liqueur, and the bitters in that order. And with that, I'm gonna put all of this together one more time and add the final piece to this ultimate yet simple old-fashioned recipe. Not only will I adopt this as my default old-fashioned going forward, but it also needs one more ingredient, and that is, of course, the garnish. I like the cherry flavor at its current level, so a maraschino cherry is instantly out. Now, an orange peel is obviously staying as it's part of the orange flavor in the drink, and it could be just fine without anything else, but I still think it's missing something. I think it's the richer flavors from this kind of requires something a little bit darker than the bright orange peel to really pop all of those different ingredients. So from that standpoint, I'm gonna go ahead and grab cinnamon, and I'm also gonna go ahead and grab the cloves as well as the star anise. So the cinnamon's nice, but is similar to the maple syrup. It's too extreme if I want to keep this as a simple old-fashioned. I mean, the cinnamon is bringing this unique and pungent smell that does work nicely with what's here, but it's too far of a deviation from a classic old-fashioned. So the cloves work incredibly well, but they are very potent. I always think of dark rum when I smell cloves, and in this instance, it goes nicely with this more vibrant old-fashioned because I get cloves from Angostura bitters. And even though I've reduced their influence on this final drink, that clove finish from the bitters is still here. And this does enhance that in a really nice way. When you're making new drinks, you don't always have to add new flavors. It's adding different layers of the same flavor or similar flavors to really draw some of that out. So I actually really like the cloves here, and I was kind of expecting to go for the star anise, but I don't really know if these can top that. Okay, that's really good too, actually. All right, so the star anise was what I expected to kind of win this overall. It definitely enhances the star anise and the Peychaud's bitters to a level that I would not necessarily want, but at the same time, I really like it. So I'm kind of leaning back towards the cloves, and the fact that this is both enhancing an existing flavor as well as doing something a bit new, and I can't justify going away from it. So I'm going to add 3 whole cloves to this, and the smell is absolutely wonderful. If you go any more, it becomes more clove forward, whereas the purpose of a garnish is not necessarily to override the flavors in a drink. And with this being such a similar but prominent smell, it just goes perfectly with everything else in the drink. And with that, I firmly believe this is my ultimate yet simple old-fashioned recipe that might be tailored towards the Wild Turkey 101, but I think would go wonderfully with most other kind of higher proof budget bourbons. By using a higher proof bourbon, those bourbon flavors will go toe-to-toe with the cherry and the orange. And at that point, this becomes a more flavorful cocktail whilst retaining the balance yet emphasis on the bourbon that I was looking for. This is the completed map that I took to get to my perfect old-fashioned. It's not a revolutionary cocktail by any means, and it's actually very simple, but it's the first time that I've compared all of these different ingredients to see which combination I like best. Now, I've talked about what this tastes like repeatedly throughout this video, but it's kind of been in sections. What I haven't talked about is how does this compare against a normal old-fashioned now that it is a full cohesive drink? And the biggest difference is the anise flavor, but it goes so well with the heavy oak, the dark cherry, and the bright orange that it's instantly recognizable as an old-fashioned, and a somewhat classic one at that, even if it is more complex and the flavors are more intense. This old-fashioned maintains the balance and drinkability of a normal old-fashioned, but the flavors are more pronounced thanks to the higher proof bourbon and the extra ingredients. It's very smooth and toes the line between syrupy and thin perfectly. The cherry is slightly more dominant than the orange, but both come together to give a welcome freshness to this otherwise bourbon-forward drink. Some might prefer less flavor, but to me, this is the perfect balance of everything I enjoy in an old-fashioned. That's it for my video on making the best simple old-fashioned to pair with the Wild Turkey 101. Now, unfortunately, I have drunk more than my fair share of bourbon over the last couple of episodes, so for the next video, I'm going to be making old-fashions using other spirits that are not bourbon or whiskey. Now, if you haven't liked and subscribed, then please do so, but above all else, thank you so much for watching. Cheers!